Hello and welcome to Doom Does DVD. In this week, running up to Halloween, I have been watching the Wrong Turn series. So let's have a talk about that. I picked up this box set of the films Wrong Turn 1 through 5 a couple of years ago. It was cheap and second-hand, and I thought, there's five films, at least one of which I've seen before, and I thought it might make an interesting series for this channel. But what I know now is that even though YouTube likes it when you pad your content, making an entire series out of these films would have been quite a bit of a stretch. But we can still do a little summary where we cram them all into one. So prior to this week, when I've been watching these films, I had definitely seen the original Wrong Turn at some point in the past, but it had been a very long time ago. I remember when it came out at the time, it was the kind of thing that does get on my radar as a horror fan who is a particular fan of the getting lost in the wilderness and weird shit happens subgenre. And I was also a fan of Star Elijah Dushku on Buffy, so putting all those things together, it had the elements of things I should like. And my memory of it was that I had enjoyed it. The collection here says contains all 5 films, but when I started doing research for this video, I realised that that isn't actually all of the films. This set appears to have been released in 2012 originally, but there was actually a Wrong Turn 6 in 2014. Although after a quick skim of Wikipedia, it seems that Wrong Turn 6 was kind of like a reboot, despite being called Wrong Turn 6, even though there was also a recent complete reboot just called Wrong Turn again just last year, or this year, pandemic releases being weird. So this isn't the complete Wrong Turn series, but given the state of how things had gotten by Wrong Turn 5, I think that was probably enough anyway. But let's break them down one by one, starting with Wrong Turn. First hurdle to get over with on this one is it's one of those discs that had 6 trailers on the beginning and no option to skip to the menu. I'm glad that that's a trend that seems to have kind of gone away on most Blu-rays, but eventually you get into the film itself and the immediate impression is just how dated everything looks. Not so much the early 2000s setting of the actual film, but more like, the graphics and style of the credits. It's just not really done that way anymore, and it's interesting how much that style really does sort of evoke that period. So you see it and it's like, wow, this is very early 2000s. And unfortunately things don't actually get a lot better from there. The whole thing is very generic and very tropey, and it only really manages to hold things together by taking those tropes completely seriously. And so while obviously the budget is quite low compared to your massive blockbusters, you end up with a fairly generic film, but it's well made. So you end up in this sort of just above the middle range. It's not so good, it's good. It's not so bad, it's good. It's just alright. Sort of everything about it, acting, directing, writing, it's all just fine, but nothing particularly exceptional. Although saying that the writing is fine, I did make a specific note of the final line of the film. Come on, you motherfuckers, just die. If that's not the most generic catchphrasey ending, then I don't know what is. And there were a couple of times in the direction where, some slightly different, interesting camera moves were attempted, but the problem with those is compared to everything else, they kind of stuck out. And I'm sure it definitely helped having Stan Winston's team work on all the special effects and gore and things like that. So in summary, Wrong Turn, probably not quite as good as it was in my memory, but still good enough that, I probably would turn it on every now and again. Whereas the rest of the series, I'm not quite so sure, so let's talk Wrong Turn 2, Dead End. According to my Letterboxd profile, I had already marked this as seen at some point in the past. However, I don't remember anything about it at all. Watching it brought back zero memories. Well, actually, not zero memories. There is one special thing this disc does have, which I've not seen in a long time, and that's the "you wouldn't download a car" anti-piracy ad. But yeah, as is so often the case with this kind of low-budget horror sequel, there's just everything about it is just a little bit less, which all boils down to money, and in the end you can hire less lighting or less experienced actors and writers, and it's just overall that all adds up into a less good thing. Obviously each of these stories needs some kind of setup to get a bunch of characters lost in the woods somewhere, and this time it's a reality TV program. Another thing which is very early 2000s, but it also wastes quite a lot of time at the beginning, you know, setting all the premise for that up, despite the fact that it's not really that important. Of course, you do need to spend some time at the beginning of these things, you know, getting to know the characters so that you might start to care about whether they die or not. The problem is, with this one, and the first one actually, is that doesn't really succeed. I never find myself caring enough about any of these characters to be bothered or not if they died. This one has a few interesting kills in it, but it doesn't have a lot more going for it than that. It's a bit of a weird mix of tones and a bit inconsistent and just a bit less overall. So moving right along, Wrong Turn 3, Left 4 Dead. From this point on I hadn't previously marked any of these as seen before, so I'm pretty sure this was my first time watching 3, 4 and 5. This one feels a little bit different because we get to see a lot more of the wider world. The first two are very much your typical lost in the wilderness, just people stuck in the woods running around getting killed. But this time we see a bit more of the outside looking in, like, you know, police officers going to look for people who have gone missing. Because unlike random backpackers who have gone missing, the police were kind of trying to keep track of the van full of prisoners that have gone missing this time. Still though, the script is full of tropes, and one of the prison guards talks about retiring 5 minutes before dying, and anything in there that you might consider foreshadowing is like basically putting a sign up on the screen saying this is going to be important later. It's just not very subtle. And yet I think of the 5, I kind of enjoyed this one the most, and that's because of one of the things I just complained about from the first 2 films, is that for this one I actually found myself caring about a couple of the characters. Not that I remember any of the characters' names, but whoever Janet Montgomery was playing and the main cop guy, I find myself invested with their story. That was unfortunately right until the end, as is often the case in this kind of horror film. Like the very last scene will be like a complete shocking twist of some sort. This film has one of those which I felt completely undercut the entire emotional ending of the film. And the most important thing, which never actually happened in this film, is no one made a wrong turn. In both the first 2 films there's a specific point. There's a guy in a car at a junction, he's got 2 ways to go and he picks the wrong turn. It seems like in a series of films called Wrong Turn that would be, you know, an important point, but that never actually happened in Wrong Turn 3 at any point that I noticed. I guess it's about a bunch of prisoners, they made a wrong turn in their life to get there. That's a bit of a stretch. So while far from perfect, it's also still quite a lot better than a lot of the low budget horror out there. And while obviously it's not going to be for everyone, it's probably one I will actually watch again. At which point I'll probably see the flaws I glossed over the first time round and never watch it again. So then we've got Wrong Turn 4, Bloody Beginnings. The thing about horror films is that generally by the end you need the good guys to have won to get that satisfying ending feeling. Yes, sometimes you can go for a complete dark and despair ending, but if you did that every time, that would lose its appeal. Generally, after an hour and a half of detention, you need that release of the final girl using her wits and escaping. But that leaves the problem in a long-running horror series is what to do. How do you keep bringing back the same big bad enemy when they also keep getting killed at the end of each film? Now in this particular case, having them being regenerative radioactive cannibals does help a bit, but it still does kind of stretch things with you for them to keep coming back to life again and again every single time. So how do you deal with that? Beginnings. Prequels. It turns out though that this wasn't quite as much of a prequel as I expected it to be. I was expecting more of an origin story, but it's actually just an earlier story. It's set before the first Wrong Turn, but not long before then. It's got a couple of flashbacks further back to the 80s, but that's not really when it's set. So it starts to make the whole timeline of things a little bit confusing. Not helped by the fact that the actors in the flashback portion of the film were some of the worst I have seen in a very long time. Particularly the main doctor guy, who's basically doing a big info dump for the viewer. It's just so clunky, it was terrible to watch. It visually is nice and a bit distinctive though, because this one's set at winter, so everything's covered in snow and things like that, so it looks different than the big open forests of the previous three. This one does have a wrong turn moment, but at this point they've turned it into a joke. The group of kids that we're following this time are on a bunch of snowmobiles going through the snowy woods in the middle of nowhere. They stop, our lead guy's lost, but claims he isn't. Lead lady says, I'm pretty sure it's over here, but of course is instantly dismissed. Lead guy says, I'm sure it's this way. They all head off in that direction, and comic relief guy says, he's making a wrong turn, I know it. Which may as well have been said with a nod and a wink to the camera. So they all end up lost in the snow in the middle of nowhere. They need shelter and find an old abandoned asylum, which happens to be where the radioactive cannibals are currently living. From there on, it's what I would call a generic gore fest. The focus here is entirely on the setup for and then the execution of people's deaths. Nothing else really seems to matter so long as it looks cool. Then the problem with that is that the budget is obviously fairly low and they can't spread that very far. So it's a generic gore fest, but not a very big one. So that which leaves this one with very little to offer except some bad acting and some dodgy CGI blood. So yeah, Wrong Turn 4, mostly meh. And finally for today, Wrong Turn 5, which is probably the absolute worst of the bunch. This one's set at Halloween, so it's got that timeliness going for it regarding with this video, but that's about it. The timeline gets even more confusing here. I wasn't quite sure where this one fit in till I read Wikipedia afterwards. It's like, this is a prequel sequel. It's set after Wrong Turn 4, but still before the first Wrong Turn. This confusion wasn't helped at all by the fact that there's a character here played by Doug Bradley, who you may or may not know better as Pinhead. And I thought he was some weird new character, but apparently what I read afterwards is that he was actually supposed to be a character we'd already met in the first two films, but played by a different actor. That was never made clear to me, so again, it was just confusing. The wrong turn that was made this time was even more of a joke. We're not lost in the woods this time, or even lost in any kind of wilderness. The setting is a town centre. So some small town is having a big Halloween festival thing, and you know, everybody comes to have a big party. Somehow, the entire town and everybody going to the party is at the party in a field in the middle of nowhere, and we're left with like 5 people in the town centre to have a film with. It's like, that's not how large events work. There's fringe events, there's people get too drunk to even get to the party, and you know, there's masses of people everywhere. The whole thing kind of takes place on like one street of this little town and the sheriff's office, and that's it. If it weren't for our radioactive cannibals, you wouldn't think this was related to the rest of the series in any way, shape or form. Doug Bradley has to make a joke about people being pinheads. The police chief is far too eager to just hand out shotguns to random civilians that she only met like 2 hours ago. But mostly it being set in a completely empty town centre aside from like 7 people, while, you know, hundreds of people are in a field a few miles away. It just felt completely unrealistic that it took me right out of it. And the fact that the one street of the town that they've got is obviously an indoor set with not very good lighting. It's just I'm having a bad time coming up with any redeeming qualities for this one. Okay, one redeeming quality, much like the last two actually. There were some very inventive kills, but on its own, that's not enough. So yeah, that was Wrong Turn 1 through 5. The collection fans have been screaming for. I'm not entirely convinced about that. There are some merits to some of them if you're already a fan of low-budget horror. But if that's not you, then you could definitely give these ones a miss. Well, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. Do you have any thoughts on the Wrong Turn series? Tell me about those in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.